There is a moment, and every soldier in every species across every war in the known galaxy has felt it, where the body understands something the mind refuses to. The Velthari called it Crestfall, the moment before the end. Commander RYX of the Velthari High Command had survived 43 engagements across 6 star systems. He had watched entire fleets dissolve into light. He had given orders that erased cities from orbit and filed the reports before the smoke cleared. He was not a creature who feared much. But on the day the humans charged, not retreated, not regrouped, not called for extraction, on the day they charged into a line that should have killed every single one of them, Commander RYX felt something move through his chest that he had no word for. He had studied humans. Every commander in the Galactic Compact had studied humans after the siege of Meridian. The reports were thorough. The data was clean. The conclusion was unanimous. Humans are inefficient combatants, high in emotional volatility, prone to irrational decision-making under pressure, likely to fracture under sustained psychological stress. The reports were wrong. Not about the volatility, not about the irrationality. They were wrong about what those things meant. RYX would spend the next 3 years trying to explain what he saw that day to the Compact's High Council. He would use every word in the Velthari language. He would commission translations in 17 other tongues. None of them had the word for it either. This is his account. What he saw, what he learned, and the thing that moved through his chest that day, the thing he eventually, with great reluctance and greater humility, named. It was fear, but not of the humans, of what it meant that they existed at all. Commander RYX had been standing at the observation deck of the Veth Nurum, the flagship of the Compact's 7th Outer Fleet, for 6 hours when the Battle of Crestfall Station began. He had his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture of Velthari Command. His 4 eyes tracked separate quadrants of the tactical display simultaneously, the way his kind had been trained since youth. His breathing was measured. His heart rate was low. He was, by every biological and psychological metric available to the ship's medical AI, completely calm. That was how Velthari fought wars. With calm, with precision, with the cold, mathematical certainty that war was a problem, and problems had solutions, and solutions required clarity of mind above all other things. The battle had been anticipated for 11 days. The Compact's intelligence network, the finest in the known galaxy, maintained by 7 species across 4 centuries of cooperation, had given them everything. The Neth Collective, a raiding coalition of 4 smaller civilizations who had grown bold after the Compact's losses near the Riven Nebula, had been building toward this engagement since the previous rotation. Their fleet composition was known. Their commander, a creature called Ashdeva of the Threnki, was a known quantity. Her strategies had been cataloged, modeled, and countered in simulation 400 times. The Compact expected to win. Not easily, but predictably. Predictability was everything. Predictability was survival dressed in mathematical clothing. What the Compact had not predicted was the humans. They had been in the Compact for 11 years at that point. A young membership, a strange one. When a Velthari delegation had first made contact with humanity's representative body, a messy, fractious, exhaustingly loud organization they called the United Earth Parliament, the reception had been complicated. The Compact had welcomed many species across its long history. It had protocols, membership criteria, a standard integration pathway that had worked reliably for 400 years. The humans had ignored most of it, not aggressively, not with hostility, with a cheerful, baffling indifference to the weight of what was being offered to them. The Velthari ambassador, a scholar named Vor, who had dedicated her career to first contact diplomacy, had presented humanity with a full Compact charter. For centuries of accumulated interstellar law, the foundational document of galactic civilization, the human representative had flipped through it, nodded a few times, and said, "Yeah, this looks fine. Can we talk about the part where we get ships?" Vor had needed 3 days to process that response. The humans had been given ships. Not many initially. The Compact was cautious with new members. They were given 2 escort-class vessels, a handful of shuttle-capable fighters, and a small fleet support role in the Outer System Patrol Network. The expectation was that they would serve in a logistical capacity for a decade or two, learn the rhythms of compact military structure, and slowly integrate into more active roles as their command culture matured. 6 months in, a human captain named Hyun had taken her escort vessel into a contested debris field to pull 3 trapped Kelvari miners out of a hull breach, while a Neth collective raider was actively firing on the wreck. The Kelvari had a standing evacuation policy. Do not risk crew for already compromised civilians in active engagements. It was in the manual. Hyun had acknowledged the manual in the pre-mission briefing. Then, she had done what she did anyway. All 3 miners survived. Hyun had filed the incident report with the brevity of someone noting a minor scheduling conflict. The report said, asterisk deviated from protocol. Outcome satisfactory. Will debrief on request. Asterisk Compact Command had spent 6 weeks debating whether to discipline her. They didn't. Mostly because the Kelvari had thrown a ceremony in her honor that lasted 4 days, and they couldn't figure out how to punish her without creating a political incident. But the incident had been noted. The humans had been noted. A quiet flag went into the Compact strategic planning files. Asterisk human forces, unpredictable under pressure. Monitor, asterisk RYX had read that file. He had read all the files on the humans in the months before Crestfall. He had been assigned a human auxiliary unit, 40 soldiers, 2 support ships, 1 commander, and had spent considerable time preparing himself to manage their unpredictability. He had done this with the methodical care he applied to all problems. He had studied their military history on Earth. The wars were numerous and, frankly, appalling. They had been fighting each other for the entirety of their recorded civilization, which was an anomaly even by the chaotic standards of younger species. Most civilizations, once they developed spaceflight, redirected their violent tendencies outward or sublimated them into competitive culture. The humans had continued fighting each other until roughly 40 years before first contact, and, even then, had only stopped because the exhaustion had become mutual and the environmental damage had reached a point where continued conflict threatened their survival as a species. They had not stopped because they wanted peace. They had stopped because they had run out of things that weren't already broken. This was in a file. RYX had read the psychological assessment 3 times. The consensus among the Compact xenopsychologists was that humans carried what they called a combat imprint, a species-level conditioning toward conflict that millennia of warfare had baked into their collective psychology. They were not unusually cruel, the assessment noted. They were not unusually aggressive in day-to-day social interaction. In fact, human diplomatic corps members were frequently noted for warmth and adaptability. But put a human in a situation their body read as a survival threat, and something turned over inside them like an engine catching. The assessment's conclusion was cautious. Human units should not be positioned in engagements where emotional volatility could compromise strategic objectives. RYX had read that conclusion and agreed with it completely. He had positioned the human unit accordingly. Auxiliary support, rear flank, low exposure. Their job at Crestfall was to hold the station's secondary docking ring against any Neth forces that broke through the main engagement, and to protect the civilian evacuation corridor. It was not a glamorous role. It was by design a safe one. The main engagement would be handled by the Velthari and Kelvari frontline ships. The humans would stand by, hold the line, do nothing dramatic. RYX had thought about this plan. He had thought it was good. He was, as it turned out, badly wrong about several things at once. The engagement began at 0400 station time, which the humans apparently found funny for a reason no one bothered to explain. The Neth Collective came in hard from the star's shadow, a classic approach that RYX had modeled and anticipated, and the initial exchange went almost exactly as the simulations predicted. 3 Neth destroyers took heavy damage in the first volley. 2 compact frigates sustained shield failures and fell back for repair. The lines pushed and pulled in the ugly, grinding way of fleet engagements, each side feeding energy into the contest like 2 creatures locked jaw to jaw. Then, Ashteva did something the simulations had not predicted. She split her fleet. Not in the standard tactical sense. She committed a full third of her remaining ships, her heaviest units, the ones carrying the mass driver arrays that could crack station hull plating, directly toward the secondary docking ring. Not as a feint, as a full assault vector. She was going to punch through the rear flank, destroy the evacuation corridor, and leave 12,000 civilians on a station with no way out while her main fleet pinned the compact's frontline forces in place. It was ruthless. It was tactically elegant. It was the kind of move that our YX, under any other circumstances, would have noted in his post-engagement analysis with professional admiration. He had approximately 90 seconds to respond. The compact's frontline forces could not disengage to reinforce the rear. The main Neth fleet would push through the gap, and the engagement would collapse. Our YX had reserve units, but they were positioned to cover the northern approach, and repositioning them would take 4 minutes. The civilian evacuation ships had already launched, but were only 20% complete. The corridor needed to stay open for another 11 minutes. 11 minutes. No reserves available. Nothing standing between 12,000 civilians and Ashdeva's mass drivers except 40 human soldiers, 2 lightly armed support ships, and a commander named Lieutenant Colonel Yara Osei, who was 29 years old and had been in the compact auxiliary for 18 months. Our YX opened the communication channel to the human unit. Lieutenant Colonel Osei. He kept his voice level. There was no point in projecting panic. I need you to understand the situation. He told her. He told her about the split fleet, the mass drivers, the evacuation status, the 11 minutes, the fact that his reserves could not reach her in time, and the front line could not disengage, and there was no tactical solution he could offer her that did not involve her unit being destroyed. He told her all of this in the crisp, factual language of Velthari military communication. He did not soften it. Velthari commanders did not soften things. Softening was a form of disrespect. It implied the recipient could not handle truth. There was a pause on the channel. For seconds. Our YX counted them. Then, Osei said, "Copy that, Commander. We'll hold. Just that. Nothing else." Our YX watched his tactical display. The Neth heavy units were closing on the secondary docking ring at combat speed. They were massive, each one twice the tonnage of anything the human auxiliary had. Their mass drivers could fire at effective range in 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, if the human unit had not stopped them or slowed them significantly, the first shots would start landing on the evacuation corridor. He watched the human support ships move. They did not move into a defensive formation around the docking ring. They did not take up a holding position. They accelerated toward the Neth fleet, directly toward it, on an intercept course and maximum burn, which for their class of vessel was a speed that our YX's tactical AI flagged as reckless given their shield capacity versus the incoming weapons fire they would encounter. Behind the support ships, the 40 soldiers had breached the outer hull of the docking ring service tunnels and were moving. Our YX pulled up their suit telemetry to check, and, yes, they were actually moving into the external superstructure of the station. In hard vacuum, in active combat, climbing the outside of the station like insects on the hull of something vast, and indifferent, carrying weapons that were rated for interior combat, and were going to be significantly less effective in open space. Our YX watched this for a moment. He did not have words for what he was watching. Not immediately. He understood the tactical logic. The soldiers were repositioning to get firing angles on the Neth ships' less armored approach vectors. The support ships were rushing forward to force the Neth commanders to respond, and by time. The logic was present. It was just wrapped around something else, something that the tactical logic did not fully explain, some additional quality that our YX's mind kept circling without landing on. The support ships hit the leading Neth destroyer at ramming distance and opened fire from inside its point defense envelope, which was a thing that was not supposed to work, which was a thing that the Velthari tactical doctrine specifically identified as ineffective and wasteful, and which worked somewhat in the sense that the destroyer's forward shields collapsed under the concentrated close-range fire, and it had to pull back to avoid a hull breach. The other Neth ships adjusted. They started firing. The support ships took damage. One of them lost its primary engines and went into a slow spin, but kept firing on its secondary systems. The soldiers on the hull had reached their positions. They started firing too. Small caliber weapons against warship armor, which was, again, not supposed to work. But they were targeting the sensor clusters, the communications arrays, the guidance nodes on the mass driver mounts. Small, precise, irritating damage that a warship's automated repair systems would spend processing time fixing, and that would degrade targeting accuracy on every weapon system that relied on those nodes. The Neth formation slowed, not stopped, slowed. Ashdeva's captains were disciplined. They adapted, shifted formation, assigned 2 ships to suppress the hull soldiers while the others pushed forward. But the push was slower now, more cautious, because something about this engagement had changed the calculus in ways that were hard to quantify precisely. HFY watched and tried to quantify it anyway. The humans were losing. Objectively, by every measurement available to him, the human unit was being destroyed. One support ship was crippled. The other was taking hits it would not survive much longer. 11 soldiers on the hull had already registered as casualties on the telemetry. The Neth fleet was still advancing, still on track to reach effective mass driver range, still going to do the thing Ashdeva had sent them to do. And yet the humans were not stopping. This was the thing HFY's mind kept circling. Not the tactics, not the courage. Exactly. HFY had seen courageous soldiers before. Courage was a documented phenomenon. It was in the psychological literature. Creatures fought when cornered. Creatures protected their young. Creatures made sacrificial choices when the emotional stakes were high enough. Courage was understood. This was something adjacent to courage, but not quite the same thing. The humans knew they were losing. Their suit telemetry fed directly to their command network. They could see the casualty numbers, see the damage reports on their ships, see the same tactical picture HFY was seeing. They were not operating under any illusion about how this was going. And they were not performing acts of desperation or panic. Osei's voice on the command channel was steady, almost conversational. She was talking to her soldiers with the calm of someone who had already done the math and arrived at a conclusion and was simply executing the conclusion now. The conclusion appeared to be, we hold for 11 minutes or we die trying, and both of those outcomes are acceptable outcomes, so let's get to work. HFY had read about human soldiers. He had read the histories, the psychological profiles, the tactical analyses. He had thought he understood what he was reading. He was only now, watching this in real time, beginning to understand that he had not understood it at all. At 8 minutes and 40 seconds, his reserve units completed their repositioning. At 9 minutes and 12 seconds, the first reserve ships opened fire on the Neth rear flank. At 10 minutes and 51 seconds, Ashdeva, caught between the compact reserve and the maddening, grinding, costly resistance of 40 humans and 2 broken ships, made the decision that HFY had been waiting for. She pulled her heavy units back. Not a rout, an ordered withdrawal, but a withdrawal. The evacuation corridor held. HFY stood at his observation deck and watched the engagement data resolve into a compact tactical victory. His breathing was measured. His hands were still clasped behind his back. He was, by every external measurement, the same commander he had been 6 hours ago. Something had changed, though. Something in the way he was looking at the tactical display. Something in the way his 4 eyes, trained since youth to track separate quadrants simultaneously, kept returning to the same place. The secondary docking ring. The telemetry of 40 humans, 11 of whom were dead, 22 of whom were wounded in vacuum, on the hull of a station, in the middle of a battle they had been told in plain language they could not win. Still there, still holding. He opened the channel to Lieutenant Colonel Osei. He meant to say something formal, something of the Velthari command tradition, an acknowledgement of effective execution. There was a phrase for it. He had used it 1,000 times. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he could not remember the phrase. Lieutenant Colonel, he said. Commander. Her voice was tired. Not defeated, just tired, the way a person sounds after something very hard that they did anyway. The corridor held. Yes, sir. 11 dead. Yes, sir. A pause. He could hear her breathing. They knew. HFY did not say anything for a moment. He was a commander of 43 engagements. He had lost soldiers before. He had given orders that cost lives. He had done all of this with the cold, mathematical certainty that war was a problem and problems had solutions. He looked at the telemetry of the 11 dead soldiers on the hull of Crestfall station. Then he looked at the number 12,000, the civilians in the evacuation ships, still en route to safety. He thought about the math. He had always been good at math. For the first time in his 43 engagements, the math felt like it was pointing at something larger than itself. Something he didn't have a clean equation for. "Get your people inside," he said. "Medical is on the way." "Copy that, Commander." He closed the channel. He stood at the observation deck for a long time after that. He was thinking, and what he was thinking was this. He had been given a file on the humans. He had read it thoroughly. He had taken the file's conclusion, unpredictable, volatile, monitor, and built his strategy around it. The file had not been wrong exactly. It had just been looking at the data and asking the wrong question. The question the file asked was, what are humans likely to do? The question that Crestfall Station had just answered, loudly, at the cost of 11 lives and 2 crippled ships and 22 wounded soldiers on an outer hull in vacuum, was a different question entirely. The question was, what are humans willing to do? Arwaics had a feeling, standing there in the quiet aftermath of the engagement, that those 2 questions had very different answers. He also had a feeling that he had only just begun to understand the second one. 3 weeks after Crestfall Station, Arwaics was summoned to the Compact High Council. This was not unusual. He had appeared before the Council 11 times in his career, always in the wake of significant engagements, always to provide the kind of first-hand tactical assessment that the Council's analysts could not fully reconstruct from data alone. He had given these briefings with the same precision he brought to everything, structured, factual, free of speculation. The Council valued his reports because they were clean, because Arwaics did not editorialize. He stood before them now in the high chamber on Veth Prime, a room designed to feel eternal, with its stone walls carved from the mountain itself, and its ceiling lost somewhere in the dark above the light's reach. And he gave them Crestfall Station. He gave them the numbers, the fleet composition, the Neth tactics, the split fleet approach, the evacuation status, the 11 minutes, the margin. He gave them the human units casualties. He gave them the tactical outcome. He gave them everything in the file. Then, Counselor Ashen, who was the eldest member of the High Council and who had been making policy for 60 years, and who had the particular quality of stillness that very powerful creatures sometimes develop, looked at him and said, "Your recommendation on the Human Auxiliary Program?" Arwaics had prepared for this question. He had spent a week preparing for it. He had drafted 3 separate recommendations, refined them, tested them against the data, and arrived at a clear conclusion that he believed was justified by the evidence of Crestfall. He opened his mouth to deliver the recommendation. He paused. The pause was small, a breath. Counselor Ashen would probably not even have noticed it. But Arwaics noticed it because he was not someone who paused when he had a clear conclusion, and the pause told him something about the conclusion that he had not quite admitted to himself yet. "I recommend expanded integration," he said. "The Human Auxiliary should be restructured as a front-line combat unit with full operational authority in their designated sectors." The Council received this without visible reaction, because the Council never showed visible reaction to anything, but Arwaics knew the room well enough to read the quality of the silence that followed. It was the silence of people who had been expecting something and had gotten something else instead. Counselor Sev, who commanded the Compact's Military Affairs Committee and who had built a career on the principle of measured escalation, said, "The previous assessment flagged them as unpredictable under pressure." "Yes," Arwaics said. "You were present at Crestfall. You witnessed this unpredictability directly." "Yes." "And your recommendation is expanded operational authority." "Yes." Another silence. Arwaics let it sit. He was not going to explain himself into a weaker position. The recommendation stood. "Walk us through your reasoning," Ashen said. Not a challenge. A genuine request. She was looking at him with the attention of someone who had sensed something in that single pause and wanted to understand it. Arwaix thought about the hull telemetry. 11 dead. The steady voice on the channel. They knew. The previous assessment, he said carefully, characterized human behavior under pressure as a liability. I believe the assessment misidentified what it was looking at. Explain. Volatility in tactical decision-making is a liability when it produces erratic or self-defeating behavior. The humans at Crestfall did not behave erratically. They made a rational assessment of an impossible situation and chose the most effective response available to them, which happened to be a response that no other species in the compact would have chosen because it required a tolerance for personal cost that our doctrine does not train for and does not model. He paused again. This pause was deliberate. We do not train for it, he said, because we do not believe it is possible to sustain effective tactical decision-making while accepting those odds. The humans appear to operate under different assumptions about what is acceptable. Counselor Sev frowned. Different assumptions? You mean they don't value their own lives? No, Arwaix said, and he was certain about this in a way that surprised him, certain with the force of something observed rather than reasoned. They value their lives very much. That's why it cost them something. That's what makes it effective. The room was quiet for a long time. You're describing soldiers who choose to die, Sev said. I'm describing soldiers who choose to accept the possibility of dying in order to accomplish the objective. Those are different things. Every soldier accepts the possibility of dying. That's implicit in military service. What the humans appear to accept is a much higher probability than our doctrine would sanction. And they accept it without losing function, without panicking, without the cognitive degradation that high mortality probability typically induces in rational beings. What? Ashen asked. It was a simple question. It was the question Arwaix had been trying to answer for 3 weeks. I don't know yet, he said, but I believe it's important that we find out. He was given access to the human military archives as part of his research. It was not a small archive. Humanity had been fighting wars since before they had writing, and they had documented the later ones with an obsessive thoroughness that bordered on pathological. There were histories. There were memoirs. There were tactical analyses, psychological studies, philosophical texts, works of fiction. They had a significant tradition of fiction about war, which was unusual. Most species kept their art and their conflict in separate categories, and there were personal testimonies. Thousands of them. Common soldiers describing what it felt like to be in combat, what they thought about, what they were afraid of. Arwaix read them all, or as many as he could in the 2 months he spent on this project. He used a translation AI and read in Velthari, but he noticed early on that something was lost in translation and began teaching himself basic English to read the originals, which he found was a better access point to what the documents were actually saying. The recurring theme was not what he expected. He had expected fear. There was fear. Every account described it. But the fear was not the center of the accounts. It was more like the weather in them, a constant condition that the humans noted and then moved through. What the accounts centered on was something else. The accounts centered on each other. Soldier after soldier after soldier, in testimonies separated by centuries and continents and the full wild variety of human conflict, described the same thing. They were not fighting for the cause or the nation or the ideology or the abstract principle their commanders had briefed them on. Those things mattered, in the way that a reason for going to work matters. But they were not the thing that moved a person's legs forward when every nerve in their body was screaming backward. The thing that moved the legs was the person to their left and the person to their right. Arwaix read this pattern across 2 months of testimonies, and he kept expecting to find the exceptions, the accounts that described something different, a purer commitment to ideology or strategic objective. And he found some. But they were exceptions. The pattern was overwhelming. Humans fought for each other, not for humanity in the abstract, for the specific warm body next to them, who had eaten breakfast across from them that morning and had a particular laugh and owed them money from a card game and whose name they knew. Arwaix sat with this for a long time. The Velthari military philosophy was built on clarity of purpose. Soldiers fought for the compact, for the defense of civilization, for the principles that had kept 7 species at peace for 4 centuries. These were real and meaningful commitments. They produced reliable, disciplined, effective fighters who executed their objectives and did not do unnecessary things. They did not produce soldiers who climbed the outside of the station in vacuum with small-caliber weapons and held for 11 minutes when the math said they shouldn't. He found, buried in a military psychology text from Earth's mid-21st century, a rough period, the archive noted, sandwiched between two major conflicts, a concept called unit cohesion that the human researchers had studied extensively. The research concluded that unit cohesion was the single strongest predictor of performance under extreme stress. More than training, more than equipment, more than individual capability. The bonds between soldiers were a force multiplier that no external assessment of a unit's combat power could fully account for. The text gave this force multiplier a rough numeric value. HFY looked at the number for a long time. Then he went back to his Crestfall data and ran the engagement model again, this time adding the human cohesion modifier that the Earth researchers had calculated. The model, which had initially assessed the human unit's probability of holding the corridor for 11 minutes at roughly 12%, revised its output. The revised probability was 61%. HFY stared at the number. He had placed those soldiers in what he genuinely calculated to be an impossible position. He had given Osei the information and essentially said, "This is a sacrifice play." He had expected them to understand the math the same way he understood the math. They had understood a different math entirely. He requested a second meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Osei. She arrived at his office on the compact station above Neth Prime with the particular contained energy of humans in unfamiliar formal spaces, aware of the weight of things without being inhibited by it. She was shorter than most Velthari. Most humans were. She wore her uniform with a tidiness that suggested she had put care into it, not because she was impressed by the setting, but because she thought the setting deserved it. HFY found this detail interesting without being able to immediately say why. He had not formally thanked her since Crestfall. This was not an oversight. It was the Velthari way. You acknowledged effective execution. You did not effuse. She would understand this. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said, "I've been studying your unit's engagement at Crestfall. I want to understand what happened." She sat across from him. "What would you like to know, sir? I told you, on that channel, that your unit could not hold, that you were going to lose." He watched her face. "You already knew that." "Yes, sir." "You held anyway." "Yes, sir. I want to understand why." She looked at him for a moment, not with the wariness of a subordinate who suspects a trap, with something more like the careful attention of someone trying to find the right door into a room they know well. "Sir," she said, "when you told me we couldn't hold, what were you expecting me to do with that information?" HFY thought about it. Fall back to a tenable position. Protect what was protectable. Accept the loss of the corridor as the least bad outcome. She nodded slowly. "Right? That's the logical move." "Yes." "The 12,000 people in the evacuation ships," she said. "Sergeant Adebayo, he's one of mine, big guy, has a kid. He pulled up the evacuation manifest on his suit display when you told me we couldn't hold. Just to look at it. 12,000 names. He sent it to the squad channel. Didn't say anything. Just the list." HFY did not say anything. "Nobody gave an order," she said. "I didn't tell them to hold. I said we'd hold, and I meant it, but nobody needed me to say it. They saw the list. They ran the same math I ran, and I think the math they came up with was, if we fall back, we know who dies. We know the number. And if we hold and we die, at least we try to be the reason the number was different." She paused. She seemed to be choosing her next words carefully. "That's not logic, sir. I know that. I'm not selling it to you as logic. We're not machines. We don't optimize for survival above everything else. I don't know if that's a flaw or not. Maybe it is. But it's ours." HFY looked at her for a long time. "Sergeant Adebayo," he said. "He survived." "Yes, sir. He's good. Better than good." "The 11 who died. Their names." She gave them to him, without hesitation. First and last names, and for most of them a detail. The detail you say when you want someone to understand that a name is a person and not a statistic. Corporal Singh had been trying to learn Kelvari music. Private Okonkwo had been 2 months from the end of his contract. Sergeant Chun had 3 years in and would have made lieutenant within the cycle. RYX listened. He wrote the names down, which was not something Velthry commanders typically did. The AI would log them. The record would be kept. Writing them by hand was a human custom. He had read, a physical act of remembering. He wasn't sure why he did it. He did it anyway. "Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel," he said when she was done. She looked at the handwritten names. She didn't say anything, but the quality of her silence shifted the way silence can shift when something unexpected has been offered and the person receiving it is deciding whether it's real. "Say," he said, because he was Velthry and Velthry were precise about things. "I put your unit in an impossible position without adequate information about the cost I was asking for. I will not do it again without better preparation." She met his eyes. "With respect, sir, you'll do it again. That's command. What I'd ask for is that you tell us, the way you told me at Crestfall. Give us the real numbers. We can work with the truth, even when the truth is bad. Especially then," she said. "We do better when we know what we're choosing." He thought about that for a long time after she left. We do better when we know what we're choosing. The Velthry gave soldiers as much information as was tactically useful for their role. Not more. Not the full picture. Not the weight of it. He thought about Sergeant Adebayo pulling up the evacuation manifest. 12,000 names pushed to a squad channel without a word. Not an argument. Not an order. Just a choice laid out in a list given to 39 people who then decided what their lives were worth against it. RYX, who had commanded soldiers for 20 years, who had given 1,000 orders and received 100 briefings and built his entire professional philosophy around clarity of purpose. RYX looked at the 11 names he had written in his own hand and thought, "I have never given my soldiers a choice like that. I have never trusted them with the full weight of what I was asking." He sat with that thought. He let it be uncomfortable. He was Velthry, and Velthry commanders process discomfort by sitting with it and letting it do its work. It did its work. When he stood up from his desk 2 hours later, his recommendation to the High Council had grown a second section. The first section was the one he'd already delivered: expand a human auxiliary to a frontline combat unit. The second section was newer, and it was addressed not to the human program, but to the Velthry command doctrine. It began, "We have been asking the wrong question about what soldiers need to know." It was the beginning of something larger than he had planned to write. He could feel that. He wrote it anyway. The Neth Collective had been a problem for 11 years. Not an existential one. The compact was too large, too established, too deeply rooted in the political landscape of the outer systems to be existentially threatened by a raiding coalition that had, at its peak, maybe 40 ships and the support of 4 minor civilizations who could barely agree on what to call their alliance. But the Neth were persistent, and they were smart in the particular way of creatures who have spent centuries surviving on the edges of more powerful civilizations, adaptable, efficient, unwilling to take losses they didn't need to take. Ashdeva was a good commander. She had been making the compact pay for every gain since she took the collective's command 8 years ago. After Crestfall, the calculus changed. It did not change because of the tactical outcome. The compact had won engagements against the Neth before. It changed because of what Ashdeva had seen. What every Neth intelligence analyst had seen in the battle data from the secondary docking ring. 40 humans. 2 support ships. 11 minutes. The numbers were public record in the compact's engagement log, which the Neth's intelligence network accessed within days of the engagement. RYX learned this 6 months later, when a Neth intermediary, a small gray-skinned creature called Veth OSA, who operated as a trader and occasional information broker in the neutral stations along the compact's outer boundary, requested a private channel to the compact command. Veth OSA said, in the careful language of someone who has been given a message and is trying to deliver it without breaking anything, "Ashdeva wants to talk." This was unprecedented. Ashdeva did not talk. She had declined 3 compact diplomatic overtures in 8 years. She communicated through action and through the absence of action. Her speaking up now, through an intermediary, in the cautious language of someone who wanted a conversation before committing to a conversation, meant something had changed. HFY was assigned to the preliminary channel. He sat across a communications link from Neth, who sat in the neutral territory of a trading station that both sides treated as technically untouchable, and he listened. "She wants to know about the humans," Neth said. "No preamble. Direct." HFY kept his face still. "What specifically?" "At Crestfall. She wants to know what you told them." A pause. She reviewed the communications log from the engagement. The part she can't figure out is, you told their commander they couldn't win. She had access to the same tactical picture. The math was the same. She would have fallen back. "Yes," HFY said. "Why didn't they?" It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as the actual thing HFY wanted to know. Not a query, but an admission of confusion. HFY thought about Osei's office. The 11 names. "We do better when we know what we're choosing." "That's a complicated answer," he said. "She's a patient creature," Neth said. "She has time." The conversation that followed, through Neth as intermediary, over 3 sessions spread across 2 weeks, was not a negotiation. It was something stranger. HFY, who had been fighting the compact for 8 years with the cold efficiency of someone who treated war as a professional discipline, was trying to understand something that had broken one of her professional assumptions. The assumption was this: rational actors respond to information about their probability of survival in predictable ways. When told they're going to lose, they minimize losses. When told the math is against them, they adjust the math by changing the variables they can control: position, timing, engagement distance. This was not a Neth-specific assumption. It was a universal one, shared by every military culture in the compact, and, as far as the collective strategic literature of 8 civilizations could determine, universal across sapient species. The humans at Crestfall had not done this. HFY needed to know why. Not because she was curious about humans in a general sense. Because she was a military commander, and she had built her entire tactical system on the assumption that rational actors respond predictably to information about their odds. If that assumption was wrong, if there was a species of fighters who processed the information differently, who ran the numbers and arrived at different conclusions about what was acceptable, then her tactical system had a hole in it. And HFY was the kind of commander who needed to know where her holes were. HFY found himself in the strange position of explaining humans to their enemy. He did it carefully. He gave her the framework he had developed in his 2 months of research, the unit cohesion data, the testimonies, the pattern of fighting for the person next to you rather than for the abstract cause. He gave her Sergeant Adebayo and the evacuation manifest pushed to the squad channel without a word. Neth relayed this. There was a long pause on the channel. Then, "She says that's not rational." "No," HFY said. "It isn't." Another pause. "She says, if it's not rational, it should be unstable. It should break under sufficient pressure. Every irrational system does." HFY thought about this. He had thought about this himself in the months since Crestfall. It was the obvious counterargument. If humans fight for each other rather than for strategic objectives, then the way to break them is to break the bonds between them. Kill enough of them fast enough, and the social structure that's holding the unit together collapses, and the rest behave like rational actors again. "Tell her," he said, "that we tried to model that at Crestfall. She's listening. The question is how much loss it takes to break the cohesion. For most species, the breakpoint is somewhere between 30 and 50% casualties. The unit starts making survival-driven decisions instead of objective-driven ones. Standard doctrine." He paused. "The human research suggests their breakpoint is higher, significantly higher, and the mechanism that holds them together under loss is not rational. It's the opposite. The more they lose, the more the losses become personal, and the more the mission becomes personal, and the more personal it becomes, the harder it is to make the rational decision to fall back." Silence on the channel. "She understands that," Neth said finally. The tone was slightly different. "Careful. She says, that's not a military asset. That's a grief engine. Arwaic stopped. He had spent months building a theoretical framework. He had read 200 years of human military psychology. He had interviewed Osei. He had written 20 pages of analysis. In 3 words, Ashdeva had described it more precisely than anything he had managed. A grief engine, something that runs on loss, something that gets more powerful as the fuel accumulates, something that, by the logic of every rational military doctrine in the galaxy, should be a weakness, and was instead the thing that had held a corridor open for 11 minutes against a fleet that should have crushed it. Yes, Arwaic said quietly. That's exactly what it is. The diplomatic channel that opened 3 months later was, officially, Ashdeva's proposal. But Arwaic's understood, in the months of work that led to it, that the proposal had been shaped by that conversation. By a military commander who had looked at humans and understood, not as a political or humanitarian matter, but as a pure strategic calculation, that she was not going to win a war of attrition against a species whose cohesion increased as their losses mounted. This was not a comfortable position for Ashdeva. She was not a creature who made diplomatic overtures. She was a creature who found solutions. And the solution she arrived at, after Crestfall and the intermediary sessions and whatever calculations she had run in the privacy of her own command ship, was that the Neth Collective could not afford to make enemies of the humans. Arwaic sat in the formal negotiating room on the neutral station and watched Ashdeva across the table. She was smaller than he expected. Most creatures were, when you met them in person after tracking them on a tactical display for years. She had the layered, slightly iridescent skin of the Threnki, and her eyes were very still, the eyes of a creature that processed information internally and showed very little of it on the surface. She looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then, she looked past him to where Lieutenant Colonel Osei was sitting in the human delegation seats. She studied Osei the way you study something you've been trying to understand for a long time. Not with hostility, with the concentrated attention of genuine inquiry. Osei met her eyes. There was a moment between them. Arwaic saw it, though he could not have described it precisely. A moment of 2 soldiers from opposite sides of fight looking at each other and exchanging something that had nothing to do with diplomacy. Then, Ashdeva turned back to Arwaic. "You're humans," she said. Her translator rendered it in clean, accented Velthary. "At Crestfall, the 11. "Yes," Arwaic said. "They were told they would lose." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "We had a unit once," she said. It was not what Arwaic had expected her to say. "Long time ago, before I commanded. Early Neth engagements, when we were just starting. A unit got cut off. Isolated. 3 days before we could reach them. A pause. They held. We didn't tell them to. They just held. We don't talk about it much in our tactical literature. It doesn't fit the doctrine." Arwaic listened. "Always thought it was an anomaly," she said. "Exceptional soldiers. Particular circumstances. Not a model, just an outlier." She looked at him. "Then I saw your humans do it deliberately, as a standard response to impossible odds." "Not standard," Arwaic said honestly. "I was surprised too, but not anomalous." "No, not anomalous." She absorbed that. "Then what is it?" He thought about it for a moment. Thought about all the testimony he had read, all the psychology, the unit cohesion data, the grief engine. He thought about the question that had been sitting at the center of all of it since Crestfall. "I think," he said, "it's what happens when a species spends 10,000 years fighting wars and somehow comes out of it still caring about each other." Ashdeva looked at him. Then she looked at the table. Then she made a sound that his translator flagged as contextually unclear, something between a laugh and a breath, something that might have been acknowledgement or might have been grief, something that his Velthary emotional vocabulary didn't have a precise home for. "That shouldn't work," she said. "No," Arwaic agreed. "It shouldn't." The negotiations began an hour later. They were long and complicated and several times appeared to be on the verge of collapse because 8 years of conflict left significant debris that clean language had to navigate carefully. But they did not collapse. Ashdeva was a patient creature. She had said so herself. And throughout the negotiations, across 3 days and 12 sessions, she kept returning to the humans. Not as a point of contention, as a reference point. When something was particularly difficult, she would look at the human delegation and then look at whatever was difficult and seem to be recalibrating. As if the thing she had seen at Crestfall, the thing she had named with such precision as a grief engine, was serving as a kind of fixed point in her calculations. Arwaix noticed this. He was not sure what to do with it yet, but he noticed. At the end of the 3rd day, when the outline of ceasefire had been sketched in broad strokes, and the details were going to take months and probably years to properly resolve, Ashdeva stood to leave. She paused at the door. She turned back. She looked at Osei. "The 11, she said. The translator rendered it simply. "I will know their names." Osei looked at her for a moment. Then she took out a piece of paper, actual paper, which humans still use for things they wanted to mean something, and she wrote the 11 names, and she passed it across the room. Ashdeva took the paper. She looked at it for a long time. She folded it carefully, with the precision of someone who was going to keep it somewhere specific, and she put it in the pocket of her uniform. She didn't say anything else. She left. Arwaix looked at Osei. Osei was looking at the door. "She's going to remember them," Osei said. "Quiet. Not a question." "Yes," Arwaix said. Osei nodded once. Something moved across her face. Relief, maybe, or the close cousin of it. The feeling of knowing that the people you lost were not going to be numbers on an engagement report to everyone who mattered. The ceasefire held. Not perfectly. Nothing ever does in the long, complicated aftermath of years of conflict. There were incidents. There were tense months. There were moments when everything looked like it was going to break apart, and someone had to choose not to respond in kind to a provocation, and those choices were hard and not always made correctly. But it held. And in the years after, when Arwaix was asked to explain the Neth ceasefire, asked by council members, by historians, by younger commanders who wanted to understand how 8 years of consistent conflict had ended in a negotiating room in a neutral station, he would always tell them the same thing. He would tell them about Crestfall, about 40 humans and 2 ships and 11 minutes, and the thing Ashdeva had seen in the battle data that had cracked one of her foundational assumptions. He would tell them about grief engines, about rational systems with irrational cores, about the assumption, shared across every military culture in the galaxy, that rational actors respond predictably to information about their odds. And he would tell them that the humans, in 11 minutes on the outside of a station in vacuum, had broken that assumption so completely that an 8-year war had ended not because of strategic victory or political exhaustion, but because their enemy had looked at them and understood something fundamental about what they were. The thing Ashdeva understood, that Arwaix was still working out the language for, was this: the humans were not a military asset. They were not a tactical resource to be deployed. They were a civilization that had survived everything that had ever tried to break them, not because they were stronger or smarter or better equipped, but because they kept looking at the person next to them and deciding that person was worth the cost. That wasn't a strategy. It was something older than strategy, something that had been burned into them across 10,000 years of loss that they kept walking back into anyway. And it turned out that when you pointed that at a war, wars ended differently. 5 years after Crestfall, Arwaix was assigned to the Compact Strategic Integration Committee. This was not a combat role. It was the kind of assignment that came after a career of combat roles, a recognition that a commander's most useful work had shifted from the front line to the room where the front lines were designed. The committee's mandate was to evaluate how species-specific capabilities should be factored into compact military doctrine, which units went where, which tactical frameworks were built for which kinds of engagements. The theory behind the practice. Arwaix found the work strange at first. He missed the clarity of an engagement. In an engagement, the problem was obvious, and the response was immediate, and the feedback was immediate, and you always knew at the end of the day whether you had done the thing right. Committee work was slower. The problems were bigger and fuzzier, and the feedback took years. But he was good at it, and it mattered in ways that single engagements did not. The first thing the committee had to confront was what to do with the growing body of evidence about human combat performance. Crestfall had been the beginning, but it had not been the only data point. In 5 years, the human auxiliary, now restructured and expanded significantly, as per RYX's recommendation, had compiled a record that was making the committee's existing theoretical frameworks genuinely uncomfortable. The record showed humans performing, on average, at slightly below the Velthari standard on technical metrics, weapons accuracy, tactical execution, adherence to plan maneuver. They made more improvised decisions. They deviated from Doctrine more often. Their command structures were more fluid and less hierarchically rigid than Compact norm. On every metric that Compact Doctrine valued, they were good but not exceptional. Except one. The one metric on which they were anomalous was the one that existing Doctrine had the hardest time measuring: performance under catastrophic conditions. When situations went wrong, when plans collapsed, when casualties mounted, when the variables shifted faster than planning could accommodate, human unit performance did not degrade the way other species units did. It sometimes improved. The data showed a consistent pattern in which human units facing extreme adverse conditions maintained cohesion longer, made effective decisions faster, and achieved objectives that pre-engagement models had assessed as unachievable at the loss rates incurred. The committee had been arguing about what to do with this data for 2 years before RYX arrived. The argument broke down, broadly, into 2 camps. One camp said the human anomaly was a specialized capability, like any other, useful in specific high-stress engagement scenarios, but not a template for broader Doctrine reform. You deployed it where it applied and didn't overgeneralize. This was the conservative position, and it was held by most of the older committee members. The other camp said that the human data pointed to a flaw in Compact Doctrine's foundational assumptions, specifically the assumption that rational decision-making under pressure was a function of training and discipline, and that emotional suppression was a prerequisite for effective combat performance. If the humans were achieving better outcomes under conditions that triggered maximum emotional engagement, then maybe the suppression doctrine was wrong. Not just incomplete, wrong. This was a significantly more uncomfortable position, and it was held mostly by the younger members who had served alongside human units and had their own first-hand experiences to draw on. RYX arrived in this argument and was immediately identified as a significant data point because he had been at Crestfall and had also written the only serious Velthari analysis of human military psychology to date. Both camps wanted him on their side. He spent his first 3 months on the committee not taking sides, which frustrated everyone, and reading everything both camps had produced. What he found at the end of 3 months was that both camps were right about specific things and wrong about the same larger thing. The conservative camp was right that human capability was specialized. It was not a universal template. You could not simply train Velthari soldiers to fight like humans and expect the same results. The results were a product of human psychology specifically, not of any teachable technique. The progressive camp was right that the foundational assumption needed to be examined. The emotion suppression doctrine had been built on data from Velthari psychology, and it worked for Velthari psychology. It had never been rigorously tested against the full range of sapient combat psychologies because the Compact had never needed to. Every species it had integrated was broadly compatible with the emotional suppression model. The humans were not. And the question both camps had been arguing around without quite reaching, the question RYX brought to his first full committee session, was this: what does it mean for Compact Doctrine that we now have a member species whose best combat performance is produced by conditions that our doctrine specifically tries to prevent? He put the question in those terms, not as a criticism, as a genuine inquiry. The room was quiet for a while. Then, Commander Valashin, the oldest committee member and the author of the current Compact Tactical Manual, said, "You're suggesting we build doctrine around human exception." "No," RYX said. "I'm suggesting we examine whether it's an exception." Another silence. "It's 8% of our force," Valashin said. Humans were, at that point, 8% of the compact's total military personnel. It was 40 soldiers at Crestfall Station, RYX said, and they changed the outcome of that engagement and of a ceasefire negotiation and of 8 years of conflict. I'm not sure 8% captures the weight of the variable. He let the room sit with that. What followed over the next year was one of the more productive and more difficult processes RYX had been part of. It required the committee to do something that large institutional bodies find genuinely hard. Look at data that contradicted their existing frameworks, and take it seriously rather than fitting it into the frameworks that were already there. The Compact was not a bad institution. It was a good one. For centuries of it had kept 7 species at peace and built something worth defending. But like all institutions, it had developed the particular blind spots of its own success, the places where it had been right for so long that it had stopped checking. The emotion suppression doctrine was one of those places. It had been built for good reasons. Emotional volatility in combat was a documented liability across the psychology of most sapient species. The research was real. The doctrine was real. It had worked. But it had been built on a sample that excluded humans, and now that humans were in the Compact's military, the doctrine was encountering data it had never been designed to process. RYX spent a year helping the committee process it. He also spent that year with Lieutenant Colonel Osei, who had been assigned to the committee as the human advisory liaison in recognition of her Crestfall record and her subsequent role in the ceasefire negotiations. She came to his office 2 or 3 times a week. Not at his request, initially, but because she was the kind of person who treated proximity to good questions as a standing invitation to be nearby. She read his drafts. She argued with his frameworks. She brought him things he had missed. First-hand account from human soldiers of the archive had flagged as too informal for analysis, but which contained, in her judgment, the data that the formal studies had been unable to capture. One afternoon, she brought him a letter. Handwritten, paper, actual paper, which he had come to recognize as her signal that something mattered. She had found it in the archive. A soldier's letter home, from one of Earth's earlier conflicts, written from a battlefield position that should not have been survivable. The letter was practical and brief, and at the end it said, "Asterisk, I don't know if I'll make it out. I think maybe I won't. But Samir is next to me, and he's scared, and if I can keep him from being scared for one more night, then that's something. That's enough." Asterisk RYX read it twice. "That soldier," he said. "Did they survive?" "The archive has them dying the following morning," she said. He looked at the letter for a long time. "That's enough," he said, not asking, repeating it, feeling the weight of the phrase. "Yeah," she said, "that is not. No rational doctrine built around that. That soldier had no strategic objective that required dying. The letter acknowledges this. The letter is not about the war." "No," she said, "it's not. It's about Samir. It's always about Samir," she said. "That's the thing you keep almost getting and then going around. It's always about Samir. It's always about the specific person, not humanity, not the cause. Samir, who was scared, who needed someone for one more night." She looked at him steadily. "We're the most impractical military in the galaxy, and we are also, under the right conditions, completely unstoppable, and those two things are the same thing." He sat with that for a long time. Then he opened his draft document and started a new section. The section was titled, "On the Limitation of Rational Models in Predicting High Cohesion Unit Performance." It was not a comfortable section to write. It required him to say, in formal academic language, that the framework he had used for 20 years had been missing something significant. Not wrong about everything. Missing something. Specifically missing the possibility that a rational commitment could function as a strategic asset rather than a liability when it was sufficiently consistent and sufficiently collective. He wrote it anyway. The document was circulated to the committee. It was then circulated to the High Council. It generated debate. Some of the debate was sharp. Velashin wrote a response that was thorough and pointed and spent several pages arguing that RYX was romanticizing human psychology and misapplying emotional testimony as data. RYX read the response. He agreed with some of it. He wrote back with precision, acknowledging the valid points, and holding the ones he was certain of. This was also, he noted internally, something he had learned from watching the humans. The practice of holding ground not because you were certain of your own rightness, but because the evidence was clear and the evidence deserved a defender. He had not done that before Crestfall. He had updated when confronted with compelling counterarguments. That was the Velthry way. Precision meant being willing to be wrong. But there was a difference he was realizing between being willing to be wrong and having no bones in your position. The humans argued. They argued loudly and personally and sometimes badly. But when they had evidence they believed in, they held it with something that went beyond logic. They held it with the same quality they held each other. Not tightly, not inflexibly, but with enough weight that you knew the thing mattered to them. He was learning the difference. The committee's final report, 2 years after RYX joined, recommended structural changes to compact military doctrine that included, for the first time in 4 centuries, a formal acknowledgement that the emotion suppression model was species-specific and not universal. That human units should be evaluated against different performance metrics that captured their distinctive cohesion under loss advantage. That integration with human units should be formally modeled as producing force multiplication under high-stress conditions that existing doctrine did not account for. It also included a section, RYX's section, that was harder to quantify, but that the committee eventually agreed to include because the data, however uncomfortable, justified it. The section said, in precise formal language, what Ashdeva had said in 3 words in a negotiating room 5 years earlier. It said that human military units were not best understood as a tactical resource. They were best understood as a social technology, a method refined across 10,000 years of loss for converting grief and attachment into sustained collective action under conditions that would rationally produce collapse. The section noted that this was not something that could be trained. It was something that was already there, built into human psychology by the particular history of a species that had survived everything it had tried to do to itself and had somehow come out of it still caring. The section's final line, which RYX had written and rewritten 7 times, read, "The compact did not integrate a military asset when it admitted humanity. It integrated a civilization that had already been through its apocalypse and decided to stay." Asterisk, he sent the draft to Osei before he submitted it. She read it. She sent it back with 1 note, written in her handwriting at the bottom of the page. It said, "You finally got it." He read that for a long time. Then he submitted the report. The report changed things. Not overnight. Nothing in the compact changed overnight. For centuries of institutional weight moved slowly. But it changed things. The integration protocols were revised. The performance metrics were redesigned. Human units were positioned differently in engagement planning. Not as support, not as auxiliary, but as a specific and studied capability with understood parameters and understood costs. The costs were always there. That was the thing the report acknowledged plainly. The human capability was not free. It ran on loss. Every time it worked because someone had decided that someone else was worth the price. RYX never lost sight of that. In all the years that followed, in all the strategy sessions and council briefings and integration planning meetings, he never let the language drift toward the abstract. When the committee said human cohesion factor, he heard Sergeant Adebayo pulling up 12,000 names. When they said high adverse condition performance, he heard asterisk, I don't know if I'll make it out. But Samir is scared. Asterisk, he kept the 11 names in his desk. Not on a data pad. On paper, in his own handwriting. He looked at them sometimes when the work of the committee felt like it was drifting too far from the weight of what it was actually doing. They grounded him. Not because he thought about them strategically. Because he thought about them the way he had learned to think about them from the people who had known them. The way you think about specific warm bodies that were here and then were not. The way you think about the irreducible particularity of a person. Someone who owed someone else money from a card game. Someone learning Kelvari music. Someone 2 months from the end of a contract. Not a metric. Not a loss percentage. Not a cost in a column. Samir, who was scared. That's enough. He kept the names. He kept doing the work. They were not contradictions. RYX retired from active compact command in the 22nd year after Crestfall Station. He was not old by Velthary standards. He had another 40 years of useful working life ahead of him. But the kind of work that had defined his career, command, strategy, the grinding necessary business of keeping civilizations from destroying each other, had reached a point where he knew, with the same clear precision he had always brought to problems, that the people coming up behind him were better positioned to do it than he was. Not smarter, not more experienced, but closer to the current shape of things, less weighted by the accumulated assumptions of a career built before everything that the humans had changed. He stepped aside cleanly. He had no trouble with it. He had spent 22 years working on his own assumptions, the ones they had built on, the ones they had broken, the ones they had rebuilt. He understood, now, that assumptions were meant to be worked on. That was not a comfortable thing to understand, but it was a useful one. He was given a teaching position at the Compact Strategic Studies Institute on Veth Prime. This surprised some people because RYX had never taught before and was not known for the qualities that people associated with good teaching. Patience with slow learners, the ability to explain things at multiple levels of complexity, the particular warmth that made a student feel safe to be wrong in front of you. He was precise and demanding and had very high expectations and was not generous with reassurance. He turned out to be an extraordinary teacher. The reason, which he understood only gradually, was this: the best thing he had to teach was not his own expertise. The best thing he had to teach was the experience of having been wrong about something important and having had to work through it. Classrooms full of young strategic minds needed many things. But the thing they needed most, and the thing that most of their training systematically failed to provide, was a living example of a serious mind revising its understanding in the face of serious evidence. RYX was that. His first course was called, with characteristic directness, When Your Model Fails, Case Studies in Strategic Revision. The first case study was Crestfall. He taught in full: the tactical data, the human unit's performance, the communications log, including his own voice on the channel, telling Ose her unit could not hold, and then Ose saying asterisk copy that commander will hold. Asterisk he played the audio. Every year to every class. He watched the students' faces when they heard those 4 words from a human soldier who had just been told mathematically that she was going to lose. He noticed something that surprised him the first year. The young Velthary students, most of them anyway, heard the audio and looked thoughtful. They processed it as data. They ran the numbers the way he had run the numbers. They found it interesting. The 2 young humans in the first class, there were always a few. The Institute had begun actively recruiting from Earth's military academies after the Doctrine revision, heard the audio, and looked different. Something moved in their faces. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. Something that understood the audio not as data, but as recognition. He asked one of them, after class, what they had felt. She thought about it for a moment. She was from somewhere in Earth's southern continent, and she had the particular quality of stillness that some humans developed. The ones who had been through something and come out of it without needing to perform the having been through it. When I heard Lieutenant Colonel Ose say we'll hold, she said, I thought, yeah, of course she did. RYX looked at her. Why of course? Because what else are you going to do? She said. Not dismissively, genuinely. Someone told her the truth. The real numbers. 12,000 people on the other side of the corridor, 11 minutes before the mass drivers ranged in. No reserves coming. What are you going to do with that information? Fall back, RYX said. Protect what's protectable. Accept the least bad outcome. That's one thing you could do, she said. Or you could hold. At the cost of your life. Possibly. She looked at him steadily. But you'd know why. You'd know what you were choosing. And knowing what you're choosing, that matters. Not because it changes the math. Because it changes what the dying means. RYX had been a teacher for 6 months. He looked at this student who was at most 23 years old, and he felt something that he had come to recognize over the years, since Crestfall as a close cousin to the thing that had moved through his chest on the observation deck the day the humans charged. Not admiration, exactly. Not fear. Something in between. The recognition of something that worked by different rules than the ones you had built your world on, and the understanding that those rules were not lesser, were not irrational, were not a liability to be managed, were in their own domain a kind of mastery. What does it change? He asked, because he was a teacher, and teachers ask the things they wanted to understand when you know what you're choosing. She thought about it. If you fall back, she said, the people who die in the corridor, that happens to them. It's a thing the situation did. But if you hold, and you die holding, you chose that. You made it mean something. She paused. I know that sounds irrational. It does, he said. Go on. Irrational things can be true, she said, simply. That's something I think your species is still working on. He laughed. He surprised himself with it. A genuine, involuntary sound, not the velthy acknowledgement of wit, but something less controlled. She looked slightly startled. Then, she grinned. You're going to use that in a lecture, she said. I'm going to use it in a lecture, he confirmed. The years at the Institute were good ones. He learned more from his students than he had expected. He had thought teaching would be a form of giving, the transmission of what he knew to people who needed it. It was partly that. It was also the ongoing education of a serious mind that had agreed to remain in contact with the full range of what it didn't know yet. The humans he taught were a particular education. Not because they were the best students, they weren't consistently by the Institute's standard metrics. They were often the most improvising, the least doctrinally tidy, the most likely to argue with established frameworks in ways that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes simply wrong. They were exhausting in the specific way that engaged minds are exhausting. They cared about ideas personally, the way they cared about everything personally, in a way that made every theoretical discussion feel slightly more urgent than the Institute's velthy majority usually operated. He loved it. He loved it in the way you love something that keeps making you better by refusing to let you get comfortable. He loved it in the way he had come to love all the things he had learned from the humans. Not easily, not without resistance, not without the particular friction of a serious mind encountering data it had to work to integrate. He loved it in the way that velthy commanders were not supposed to love things. With investment, with caring about the outcomes, not because the outcomes were strategically significant, but because the people were real. He had learned that from them too. In his 15th year of teaching, the Institute commissioned him to write the definitive compact history of the human integration. He agreed. He worked on it for 3 years. He read everything again. The archives, the psychological literature, the engagement records, the diplomatic files. He went back to sources he had read 20 years before and found things in them he had missed the first time, which was always the way with sources that were bigger than a single reading. He interviewed Osei. She had retired from command herself by then and was doing something that he found characteristically human. She had gone back to school. Not military school, a philosophy program. She was, at 53 years old, writing a thesis on ethics in asymmetric conflict, which she described with the self-aware humor that had always been her register as very pointless and extremely important. He interviewed her for 3 hours. She gave him things the archive had not given him. The texture of what it had been like, the weight of the decisions, the way the 11 had lived before they died, and the way the surviving 29 had lived after. The way she had thought about command since Crestfall, what she had changed, what she had kept. He asked her, at the end of the interview, what she wanted the history to say. She thought about it for a long time. I wanted to say that we were scared, she said. All the time. I wanted to say that we weren't brave because we weren't afraid. We were brave because we were afraid, and we went anyway, and we knew exactly what we were going to in the most specific possible terms. The names, the faces, the amount they owed us from card games, and we went anyway. She looked at him. I think sometimes when people look at what we did at Crestfall, they want it to be something other than what it was. They want it to be heroics or tactical genius or some special quality of human soldiers that made it possible. But it wasn't any of that. It was 40 people who knew each other and knew what was in that corridor and made a choice. She paused. That's it. That's the whole thing. The choice is the story. He wrote that down. He had his tablet. He wrote it anyway in his notebook. By hand. She saw him do it and smiled. You've been doing that for 20 years, she said. writing things down by hand. Since Crestfall, he said. Why? He thought about it. He had thought about it before. He had never put it into words clearly. Because you were right, he said. That physical act. It's different from logging something. It's slower. It requires that the hand move and the eye follow, and the brain is present for the whole thing in a way that tapping a pad does not require. He looked at the notebook. It means I can't process it at distance. I have to be there with it. She looked at him for a moment. That's the most human thing you've ever said, she said. He considered this. Yes, probably. She looked at the notebook. What's in it? After 20 years. He turned to the first page. She leaned in and looked at the 11 names written in his careful Velthery script, which had learned to accommodate the sounds of human names across 2 decades of practice. She looked at them for a long time. You kept them, she said. Quiet. I kept them. She didn't say anything for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in the way that human eyes sometimes got. Not crying, not quite, but near the edge of it, in the place where an emotion has nowhere useful to go and simply fills the available space. Thank you, she said. They earned it, he said. That is not a difficult accounting. The history was published in the 30th year after Crestfall. It was titled, What the Humans Understood, A Study in Strategic and Moral Integration. The first chapter was the engagement data, the tactical analysis, the numbers precise and complete. He had always been precise with numbers. The last chapter was called The Fear, not the fear of humans, not the fear the compact had felt in the early years about the unpredictability of species that didn't optimize for survival the way rational doctrine expected, not the fear of what they would do in an engagement. The fear he wrote about in the last chapter was the thing that had moved through his chest on the observation deck of the Veth Nurum on the day of Crestfall Station. The thing he had spent 30 years finding the right language for. He had found it, finally, not in the Velthery language. It wasn't there. Not in any of the 7 official compact languages. He had checked. He had found it in English, in a text that predated the compact by centuries, written by a human who had been thinking about war and what it cost and what it meant. The word was awe, not admiration, not terror. The specific feeling produced by an encounter with something that exceeds your category for it. Something too large or too strange or too real for your existing framework to contain. The feeling of framework failure in the presence of something that deserved a bigger frame. He had felt awe on the observation deck of the Veth Nurum while watching 40 humans hold an impossible position because 12,000 names were on a list and Sergeant Adebayo had pushed that list to the squad channel, and nobody had needed to say anything after that. He had been afraid of the awe. That was the thing he admitted in the last chapter, with the directness of a mind that had spent 30 years working on its own honesty. He had been afraid of it, because awe implied that something was larger than your model, and being a commander meant your model had to be large enough to contain what you were facing. A thing that produced awe was by definition a thing you weren't prepared for. But the last chapter said, and meant, that awe was not always a signal to retreat. Sometimes awe was an invitation. The humans had been the compact for 30 years by the time he published the history. They were not the easiest members. They were rarely the most operationally tidy. They argued. They improvised. They treated rules as starting points rather than endpoints, and drove the more procedurally minded species absolutely to the edge of reason on a semi-regular basis. They formed the most intense interpersonal bonds with members of other species, which was either wonderful or very complicated depending on the day, and usually both. They had opinions about everything and no apparent ability to keep those opinions to themselves at an opportune moments. They were also the most sought-after partners in any high-stress engagement the Compact had faced in 20 years. Every unit that had integrated with them reported the same thing, that there was something in the way a human soldier operated, some combination of the names and faces attachment, and the grief engine and the deep irrational absolute refusal to leave someone behind, that changed the quality of a unit. That made the unit believe things about itself that statistics didn't quite justify. That made the unit hold, sometimes past the point where holding made sense. And Sometimes, not always, not magically, but enough times that the data was clear, the holding changed everything. RYX ended the history with the thing Osei had said in his office 30 years before. We do better when we know what we're choosing. He had been thinking about that sentence for 30 years. He had tested it against every engagement, every negotiation, every session of committee work, every class of students. He had found it, consistently, to be true. Not just for humans, for anyone. But the humans had taught it to him, and they had taught it the way they taught most things, which was by doing it in front of you and trusting you to understand what you were watching. He had understood. It had taken 30 years, and it had required him to be wrong about things he had been certain of, and to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, and to write 11 names in a notebook by hand, and to feel awe in a room where all was not professionally indicated. But he had understood. The last line of the history, which was also the last thing he ever published, because at 72 years old he had said what he had come to say, and he was comfortable with that. Read, I went to Crestfall Station expecting to command a battle. What I learned there I am still learning. I expect I will be learning it until I stop. Asterisk the humans charged in a battle, and I finally understood the fear. Asterisk the fear was not of them. Asterisk the fear was of everything I had not yet become that they had already chosen to be. Asterisk he closed the document. Outside the window of his office at the Institute, the afternoon light was doing the particular thing it did on Veth Prime in the late season, coming at a long angle across the stone buildings, catching the edges of everything and making it briefly, specifically golden. The kind of light that didn't last. He sat with it. He had been a soldier. He had been a commander. He had been a committee member and a teacher, and now an old man with a notebook full of things he had written down by hand to make sure he was present for them. He had been, in a way that careers in long institutions sometimes produce, an unlikely channel through which something important had moved into the world. Not because he had been exceptional, because he had been willing to be wrong about the right things. The light moved. The office went back to its ordinary color. He opened the notebook. He turned to the first page. He read the 11 names. He stayed with them for a while, the way he had learned to stay with things that deserved it. Then he closed the notebook. He went home. The compact continued. The humans remained. And the fear, the real one, the one that lived in the chest and opened something wider, became over time something that felt less like fear and more like gratitude. That was the last thing he learned from them. It was not the smallest.